Hi, I'm Theo, and these broadcasts are to support the blogs on nomoreshee.com's website as well as the online classes. In this episode, part 5 of our series on sacred threads, where ritual relates to Realia. Welcome back to the No More She broadcast, where we're continuing our series today on sacred threads in part 5, where we consider how the rituals that are related to what we do in our lives come about as a reality that most people don't understand. So what a person is and what allegiance a person has tends to relate to the way that they choose in their life to actually exemplify and even their appearance. So what we hope to achieve in ritual is centered on our worship and how we want to relate to this world and to the larger cosmos when we're speaking of even heaven and earth and the spiritual realm. And so in this episode, we're going to continue where we left off, talking about binding and loosing, and then understanding how that relates in the things that we wear. Those who follow a certain sports team will have memorabilia related to the teams that they are following. And they wear the colors of that team, and they will find themselves, even some of the conventions that have come out, people that do cosplay will dress up according to things that they are really into, and they will use dialogues, and they will dress up and wear the costumes and do all the things in filling that out because they're such a loyal fan to a certain tradition. And we find in religion that many people will do the same thing. And so this idea of binding and loosing we talked about in the previous episode is going to continue and go and fold back into the things that people wear in the various religions, even today. Again, one must remember we're along this continuum of participation versus privation. But it's also of life and death, as we talked about previously in other videos where we highlight the choice in Deuteronomy 30 between life and death. And Adam and Eve, when they rebelled against God, experienced death. And we are trying to get back to life. And so Hades represents the place of the dead, but also where those who have privated themselves from God by rebelling. So those evil spirits also are in that world that's below us, that is antithetical to the world above. And we are in the middle, and we have to choose whether we're going to, as C.S. Lewis makes very clear, be creatures of hell or live more like heavenly creatures. And we're on this continuum. And every decision we make either is a step in the right direction toward being more a creature of heaven, a heavenly creature, or a hellish creature. And we're bound by certain things in our discipleship that leads us to become more like heaven when we follow the rule of heaven and bind ourselves to that. And we're free, we're loosed from following the things that would make us more like a hellish creature. But when we're a hellish creature, when we do those things, then we are bound to that, and that's death. And that's the opposite of God. And we find ourselves in those situations where we do things that we all do that are more hellish. And we're bound by those things. And we need to be set free. Or we run across those who are bound, and we need to help assist them to find that freedom. So we're along this continuum, this spectrum of life and death. And we move about across it, even as it's exemplified throughout the scriptures in the models for us, that we're moving between these two things, the world above and the world below. The world above, which is of life, and the world below, which is of death. And that's where we put the bodies who die, they go down. And that's what we're trying to understand, that we're moving from the things of death and the things that brought death to the things of life into the everlasting kingdom, which Christ exemplifies in his victory over death. And that's what we're trying to achieve here. We must not forget that. Without going further into all this language of binding and loosening, we are talking about these things that tie us and what we're going to tie ourselves to and how we have ties. See how that works in the English language? We have ties to the things that bind us, that control us. Again, Paul talks about the spirit of self-control and the fruit of self-control, which is the fruit of the Spirit. And so we need to understand that when we tie ourselves to a particular thing, that we gravitate, or we flow into the gravitational flow of, we find ourselves in the orbit of that thing that controls us as it pulls us in its gravitational force. And whether we're going to align ourselves with darkness or whether we're going to align ourselves with the kingdom of light. And that's what we're looking at here. And so these things that tie about our bodies are a representation of that we're choosing to align ourselves, and how we, it's almost like a uniform that we put on these uniforms to mark on which side we are serving. And so that's what's going on here. So they represent the things that tie us to what we're going to live and what we're going to be, and their identity markers to help show in our external way that we present ourselves with the very clothing and uniforms that we wear, to signify, which army we're fighting for by this uniform that or which team we're playing for by the things that we wear. So it's all a part of identity and the way humans try ritualistically to represent for whose side that we're on. And that's through this language of binding, and how we're bounded and how we're set free from, and what we're tied to and we're untied to, and how we're united together in a certain thing that unites us to a particular group that is tied to a set of principles that identify us as a part of that group. And we're no longer tied or united to another group. We're untied from that. We're loosened from that. So all of that is at play here. Now, again, I hope that we can spend more time in binding and loosing in other series and episodes. We don't want to get too far afield here. But I did want to throw in one more comment here. This is the passage that gets my students all worked up when I teach this, because, something like the ICC commentary, the International Critical Commentary series, it's amazing, how many interpretations are listed there. For this particular passage, they list out 12 different ways of understanding it. And if I'm not mistaken, they bring up their own then, maybe a 13th, if I'm not mistaken. But when I taught this at one time, I did introduce 13 ways of seeing this. And my students went crazy and said, why would you give us 13 different ways of reading this? Why can't you just tell us the one way? And I keep trying to say on this channel that the Bible is too majestic for there to be one possible reading to encapsulate everything that's going on here. And so a passage like this that has 12, 13 different ways, and my students said, why? And I said, well, maybe you'll come up with the 14th way. There's always more room for us to understand it, and to look through and try to sort through and understand what's happening here in this, so that we can understand fully what's possibly at play here and what's possibly going on, and highlight the things. And so there's a both and perspective here, that some that are anti-supernatural, that don't want to see this as any kind of divine warrior, supernatural, spiritual warfare going on, when obviously in the first century that was highly on the table. And the preferred understanding, to the point of the rabbinical understandings and interpretations that lead to, the idea that we learn then, which things are for us to do and which way we should go beyond this. And so Jesus is kind of passing that authority of heaven and the divine council onto, away from the powers that used to rule the people, onto his human witnesses and the disciples and apostles who choose to follow him and get called Christians thereafter, to make this world a better place, in place of, in substitution of, those powers that once ruled and did such a terrible job, and everything was unjust, and how Christians are supposed to turn the world upside down and bring justice. And so the reason, with so many different understandings, it's amazing. And so I just wanted to highlight that this is the passage that I often bring up when my students go crazy. Why would you teach us 13 different ways to read this? And so you'll come up with a 14th. So you got to understand how majestic this is, and not be closed-minded to rule out needlessly one interpretation over that. Obviously, I don't hold to all the interpretations, but there is room for us to understand how this might be understood in different ways. And there's better ways to understand it than others. And some of them are, apply. And some of the other understandings may not be so applicable. And we may look at them and say, no, after careful examination, I don't think that those readings fit as well. And I don't seem to think that they're so valid. So that's what we're trying to get at here. And to keep an open mind, but a critical mind, that some things just don't fit. And, that's possible, or they don't fit as well, but maybe they're at play and maybe they're not. And that's what we have to do. We need the scriptures opened up to us, which is, Luke 24, where Jesus opened the scriptures. Obviously, we need the scriptures opened up to us by the Spirit so that we can understand these things. We're almost like that idol that needs our mouth and eyes opened so that we can see and breathe in the breath of God, but also breathe out the life of the kingdom into someone who's dying and give them spiritual CPR so that they can live again. And so we need to do that as well. Now, I can hardly do justice to this passage. Again, there's so many to deal with. And here's one connection that's often looked at, obviously, for obvious reasons. The passage in Isaiah chapter 22, verse 22, where it uses very similar language, and its, intent of, and scholars go back and forth debating, what Jesus would have meant by what he said to Peter here, and what a proclamation he's making on that mountain, and what Matthew wants to do with what Jesus said. So they're divided, but obviously there's a connection to Isaiah, where Eliakim is coming and replacing Shebna as possibly, even as high priest in a sense. Displacing him in some sense. The authority changes there. Shebna is the high priest, as most scholars have understood it, and Eliakim is surrounded by priestly language and what he wears and what he does and what he's holding, what he receives, and so it's all this priestly language. And we have here the idea of opening and shutting, and so this is going to play later on in the book of Revelation. It's going to pick up, and Revelation is very much the cosmological temple. So you have this mythological language of the cosmological temple that Jesus is building, and he's installing his representatives to replace. He's building that eschatological temple. So Michael P. Barber did an article on JBL on this, how Jesus, the messianic platform that Jesus fulfills, ties directly into this sense of Jesus building the eschatological temple. And it's very cosmological, as we know that the temple itself, the sanctuary and the tabernacle, those things are just playing off of what God did in the beginning when he established originally this space that we know as the universe. And, he's king over the universe, but he's also established what we know in Genesis 1 and 2 as his space, much like he tells Moses to build a sacred space for him, and David desires to build that, and Solomon, the son of David, ends up building it. And then, strangely enough, you have this ideal going on, concept, where in the time of Christ, they are taking this second temple that replaced the former glorious temple of Solomon that was destroyed by the Babylonians around 586 BC, and then was rebuilt around 515 BC. They're remodeling it. Herod is remodeling it using, taxes and all the temple taxes that are brought up. And I would suggest you look at Nick Perrin's Jesus in the Temple, and you'll see what's all going on there and the connections with Rome and how they're building this big, huge barn, which, again, Jesus kind of mentions in his parables. And, how they, in his trial, they point out to Jesus, hey, he said he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it. Well, in a sense, the temple will be destroyed in AD 70, and, Jesus is building the eschatological temple prophesied back in Ezekiel, the end of Ezekiel. So that's all in play here. And you have this language for binding and loosening is open and shut, the opening and shutting. And so as Jesus is doing this, it's going to be multifaceted ways of this opening language, where the scriptures are opened and provide revelation so that people can then allow and permit certain practices while prohibiting others that are, unlike Christ and going forward. And so additionally, with Jesus' arrival as God on earth and the inbreaking of the kingdom, he's opening it up to Gentiles, and he's opening it up to outsiders and all those who could not enter in for various reasons. Jesus is providing the means by which all can come in. So he's opening up that aspect, but at the same time he's shutting it on the powers from Psalm 82 that have been disobedient, and all those who would align themselves and remain outside in rebellion and be in that outer darkness that's talked about in other passages. All of this is in play, and it's all in the trappings of the sanctuary. And then the high priest and what he wears and how he represents God's man, to the point that in the Second Temple period, the literature and in the scholarship that surrounds the discussions of what's going on in the language in the Pentateuch about the priest, and even what happens when Solomon builds the temple, when they go in, the high priest kind of no longer is human, and he almost becomes more divine in a sense, or divinized, to be able to traffic as he does and move about as he does, because everything he's doing in the ritual and all the clothing and all the things that he's wearing attribute to this picture of him, walking among the divine, much like the prophets talk about when they make trips up in the heavenlies and they have these meetings in the divine council. And so again, it's pouring back to this idea of heaven and earth becoming one, and Jesus is establishing his kingdom. It's the kingdom of God is in breaking. It's very much, we moved away now from the prophetic, where God is going to use human systems to accomplish what he wants to get done, like the Babylonians he used to attack in Ezekiel's day and destroy the temple. But he's going to move away from that into the more apocalyptic, where God himself and the heavenly host are more involved in this. And Jesus is kind of mixing these metaphors in such a powerful way here to exemplify how his followers are going to kind of step into that cosmological aspect. So that's built in here. We must understand that. And the language is highly supernatural and cosmological, to the point that, many people would miss it because we've been trained in the post-enlightened world not to think in this respect, and it's these rituals that cause us to enter in to participation with those of the heavenlies. To the extent that this language is based upon heavenly decrees and what they permit and allow, and who they allow in, and who is kicked out, and all of those things in a legalistic sense of a council, a governing body, such that some have related this throughout the history of its reception among scholarship and the rabbis and whatnot, tying to the language of oaths and covenants and speaking as far as how one identifies themselves and which group they're going to pledge their allegiance to and remain faithful to that allegiance. We have in Numbers chapter 30, verse 2, if a man vows a vow to the Lord or swears an oath to bind himself by a pledge. So there's just binding language that's attached to words in association with oaths. He shall not break his word. He shall do according to all that proceeds out of his mouth, such that it's for a vow, it prevents one from using such a thing, to be very careful how one binds themselves by speaking. Now, this is modeled in creation, how God speaks and things come forth into being. God speaks and things begin to function and purpose as they are designed by God's ordering them from their chaos. And so here one has to speak and then one has to follow what one says. They're bound by that. So there's an implication here of binding an object by a powerful spell, using a similar terminology in the Targums. So, for instance, that does not accept the words of the charmers, the binders of snakes, and is more cunning than the mutterers of charms. O God, break their teeth in their mouth and break the fangs of the young lions, O Lord. So we have this idea that in this sense of binding and loosening, we have the effect of it being in conjunction with the words speaking, such that connections are made in many places, including other parts of the rabbinical literature, on how one can speak and the speech be canceled out by another. So the idea of casting spells or making curses and blessings, blessing and cursing, that's all throughout the Old Testament proclamations. So again, you can see this by the opening of one's mouth that we've been talking about. And you open yourself up to what you're going to then bind yourself to in what you can say in certain aspects of the Torah, the Pentateuch, where, a certain person makes a vow, they cannot break it, but others make a vow and their fathers can break it for them. Again, this binding and loosening, allowing, permitting, speaking, and it's all tied to, like when Adam spoke and named the animals, or when Adam spoke and named his partner, the woman, then by speaking, he's a part of participating in what God's doing. And again, when priests or prophets make proclamations, goes back to what we've been arguing throughout this series, when Jesus says, you heard it said before, but I say unto you, and he's opening his mouth, but at the same time he's opening up what they are to do, because the Pharisees and the religious leaders and the experts in the law opened their mouths and they said Moses said this, and they decreed things. And Jesus is now trying to say, you heard it said before, but I'm going to open the mouth and I'm going to open up for you to show you what God really intended when Moses spoke these words, and I'm going to open it up. And then I'm going to furthermore restrict you, that not only is it you cannot commit adultery, but you cannot think it. So he's, again, opening and shutting. He's binding and loosing, but on such a way that's so much more provocative than has previously been understood. Here we have in the rabbinical literature that two rabbis are discussing that they're going on a ship, and a certain matron said to them, "Take me along with you." They did not take her along. So she cast a spell and she seized that ship and prevented it from going. So it's bound in the sense that we're talking about she's prevented it. So she's cursed in the sense, or she's stopped it. And they, in return, cast a magical spell that then releases it. So you get this idea of binding and loosening. So people that are bound by other religious entities can be set free by the proclamation of the gospel in Jesus' name, by speaking alternatively. And so again, it's this transferal that we're talking about from darkness to light, and canceling the dominion of darkness and its death sentence into a sentence of everlasting life through the blessing of speaking in the name of Jesus, whereby when someone is unclean, Jesus or those who follow him can speak and they become clean. Or those who are sick and outcast, and they are outsiders because by nature they cannot enter in due to their condition of impurity, then through the power of God, they can speak and do a creative miracle that sets that person free and looses them from the burden that they're under and sets them free so that they can then bind themselves about the work of the kingdom and become a disciple, a follower of Christ, and bind themselves to him. And it's tied to allegiance. And we're moving here from allegiance from one power to another power, something that has power over me, and it's canceled out. And now, through that canceling, it no longer has power over me, and I am now underneath a different power. And so I move, as Paul talks about, either being a slave of sin or a slave of righteousness. And so I move from my allegiance to what used to be and what used to have power over me to then being loosed from that to which I was formerly bound, and then binding myself in allegiance to becoming a slave of righteousness by binding myself to the way of the cross, to Jesus, to discipleship, to Yahweh, to these things. And so you have this similar language tied into reversing curses and rebinding oneself to something else in other correlations. And it's interesting to note that in the East, it's very difficult for people in this part of the world to understand when one is born into something, how one can possibly transfer themselves to something else. It's very difficult to imagine. It's almost, I don't know, it's quite amazing where foreigners, Westerners can come, and then they embrace them, and they love it when Westerners embrace their religion and want to be a part of their religion. But they find it horrific when the opposite occurs, and when it's one of theirs choosing what they were born into. So how can one born into something then find themselves that's bound to that, even by their birth? How can they break that? Just, how can they separate themselves from that which they're born into and become something else? And it's only through this binding and loosening process that we can begin to understand, because you're bound to that which you're into. So you have to understand that. So how does the transfer occur? Well, one mechanism we can understand here is through the binding and loosening, where we loose someone from one connection and we open them up to be bound to a new connection. And so it's kind of interesting how this binding and loosening has been used like in the same way that Josephus used the term, where someone is accepted into a new community. So you can use it along the lines of what Paul does with the adulterer in Corinthians, where they have to be excommunicated. That sense is in view as well. Now, when we talk about someone leaving a community of faith and entering into another faith community, and how that's done through binding and loosening, and then at the same time, we have this idea of because someone is not holding to their faithful bounds, and they're living outside the bounds of what a community can accept, they are then kicked out. And so this concept is there, but it brings up the topic then of other groups and what other groups do. And so I want to move on into now discussing how other groups have used similar things in their practices that are still being practiced today. Now, even Islam practices some of this today, so it's all inside. But I have a few other examples that I want to explore. So it's tied to articles of clothing, to these threads, and we'll get more into that. How this is used across other religions, even as the Jews have used it with both their tefillin, and then also not only that, but these tassels about themselves in the tzitzit and their prayer cloths. Now, in a post-enlightened world where we've gotten away from the liturgical and the ritual and away from the spiritual, which the majority of the world still practices in much of their worship, we still have these influences among us in our midst. Those familiar with the Jesus prayer in Eastern Orthodoxy can see how it's similarly to the tefillin. And they have prayer beads and knots. And then in Roman Catholicism, there is the idea of the rosary that's there as well. And of course, all the garments within Roman Catholicism, which correspond to the Eastern Orthodoxy. Now, in Hinduism, in South Asia, there's this whole idea between children when they enter into their studies and they're given over the priestly studies. You can see that there's beads, there's involved with this string or this thread, this sacred thread, this holy thread that is their uniform for the top of their bodies. And of course, they have this markings on their forehead. This most holy part of their body is their forehead. And in a country like Nepal, it's called Pravyabandha, and this is the word holy bunt, the holy, holiness describing the situation, but also a bunt where you ban things, and so they give themselves over in holiness to separate themselves out. And when they separate themselves out, then in that instance of turning themselves over to become a priest, then that when they become a priest, that they become separate and that they practice purity. And you can see how this relates to the Hebrew word cherem, which is all over the Old Testament in what's banned. Certain people are banned from the temple precincts for whatever reason, and certain objects that are holy get defiled, or people are under this ban whenever they contact those things which are devoted to the Lord. Again, some things in this concept, some things are bound to belong to Yahweh and Yahweh alone, or his precincts, and only certain people can traffic in those areas. The high priest is only able once a year to go behind the Holy of Holies. He's banned otherwise, and all others are banned otherwise. And so, you have this idea of certain items that have special status, that have been bound to Yahweh. And when others touch those items, what happens? And certain people die, or, because they touch the things of the Lord. And, so this banning of holiness, and it's again, this open shut, this binding, this loosing. Certain people can participate, certain people are privated for different reasons of privation, and for certain ways of explaining it all in holiness, they are then to ban from that aspect because they are the mundane. And so this carries over to these other religions where these children study and they separate themselves out to become holy priests, and they wear these special garments and this sacred thread, and they do these special things that others don't do and they're banned from participating in normal life, and those in normal citizens are banned from participating in what they're doing. And so, again, it's reflexive of participation with the divine, understanding it along the lines of access. Who's granted access to these things? And so we're opening up access to a group of people that were formerly bound, and they are allowed now to access. So this power of binding and loosing, and it's just amazing how far it goes along this spectrum of life and death, of what's holy and what's not holy, what's mundane, what is pure and impure, what is clean and unclean. It all plays into this, and there's so many dynamics lying underneath these concepts that is in view here, and how God is opening up this to the Gentiles, and how God is opening it up to this, to those who are going to be called in Christ, and replace those who did not, whether they be the Psalm 82 gods that failed to bring about justice, or whether it be the political parties and the religious aspects that did not fulfill what they were supposed to do, and the temple is destroyed, like it was in Ezekiel's day, once again in AD 70, and how going forward we must participate in the things of divine between what is kosher, what's acceptable, and, what's allowed, permitted, and what is taboo and what is not. And then they have other times where they renew this and retie this, and then they have the practice whereby sisters will tie these things that bind around the wrist of their brothers in honor for them, and all the gifts and things that the brothers do for the family in a patriarchal society, and they'll become the father. And so, again, it's this binding and showing allegiance and family familiarity, and being tied to this group, and tying oneself to one's family, and honoring those. All that's in view here, and it's a part of the practices of the ancient world. And so they're carried on today in, again, this idea of banding or binding and putting something around. And they have bunts here all the time where they practice and they ban certain activities for political protest or for religious reasons, and it's a bunt. It's the same idea that's incorporated even today in the modern world. These things still appear. Thank you very much, and God bless you for listening. Stay tuned for more episodes in videos to help you with your journey from nomorec.com.